More than any other animal, the polar bear is an icon of climate change. Considering this iconic status, you might be surprised to learn that there is an international trade in polar bears. In the early days of talking about the greenhouse effect, scientists and activists had a hard time getting the public to care about this abstract, seemingly far-off threat of climate change. Polar bears, however, offered a story and a powerful visual to help the public understand the possible consequences of a changing climate. The diet of a polar bear is composed almost exclusively of seals, and they hunt those seals almost entirely on the sea ice in the Arctic. As the climate warms and the Arctic sea ice disappears, the polar bears have much less habitat where they can hunt. Scientists in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s began to document the loss of sea ice and eventually its impact on polar bears. By the late 1990s, polar bears began to appear in the media as symbols of climate change. The iconic status of these charismatic, fuzzy, white teddy bear-like animals and their extraordinarily adorable cubs achieved new heights in 2006 when the Academy Award-winning Al Gore climate change documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, used polar bears in their graphics as a symbol for the threat of climate change. In 2008, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed polar bears under the Endangered Species Act, making the polar bear the first animal listed solely due to the threat of climate change. Despite arguments from some scientists and activists that the polar bear deserved an endangered listing, the highest level of protection, due to the dire prospects for sea ice, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under George W. Bush decided to list polar bears only as threatened, one level below endangered. Over the years, there's been a lot of debate about whether the polar bear should have been used as a symbol of climate change. The criticism is largely that polar bears in the Arctic can seem far away and unrelated to people's lives and the immediate threats of climate change to people all over the world. Polar bears, critics argued, were not the best symbol for mobilizing the public to demand an immediate reduction of carbon emissions. Regardless of whether polar bears were an effective icon of climate change, the fact is that their future in the wild is in grave danger. The lowest levels of sea ice in the Arctic typically occur in September, and the latest global climate models predict that the Arctic will be practically free of sea ice in September by 2050, if not before. It is in this context that the Australian filmmaker Abraham Joffe has released his film about the global trade in polar bears, called Trade Secret. I was shocked to hear that a trade in polar bears even exists, as was Abraham when he first learned of it. Some of the trade is illegal, but much of it is illegal, and there are countries and other powerful players fighting hard to keep the trade open. Taking joy or profit in buying or selling the body parts of endangered animals seems to plumb the depths of depravity, but sadly it's a reality, and Abraham's film brings this story to light in a captivating way. I saw Trade Secret last fall during Climate Week in New York City at the Climate Film Festival, where my film, Raising Anaya, was also screening. Soon after the screening, Abraham sat down with me to discuss how he found this story and the epic journey to make the film. I'm John Fiege, and this is Chrysalis. You can subscribe at johnfiege.earth, where you will also find show notes and all episodes of the podcast, plus my writing, photographs, and films. Here is Abraham Joffe. So I want to start, if you could just tell me where you grew up, and when you were a kid, what was your relationship to animals and the rest of nature?
Good question. Well, I was born in Sydney, Australia. You can tell by my accent, although I'm not terribly ochre, they say, although if I hang around Aussies or I start thinking about Australia, I get a bit more ochre. But I grew up, I had an incredible childhood, which absolutely informed and set me on my course for the rest of my life. Very unusually, my parents took me and my three siblings around Australia for 3 years in a caravan and a 4x4 truck. And we travelled the country having experiences, no school. I mean, we did some schoolwork. My mum was a teacher, primary school teacher, which helped. But 3 years from the age of about 11, for myself, I was the oldest of four, we travelled the country. My parents were writing books about extraordinary unknown Australians. They'd written these series of oral history books, tracking down the most incredible living treasures of Australia. And I was witness to many, many of those interviews, as well as experiencing the outback, the beaches. We travelled all corners of the country And I feel like a good ambassador for Australia, not only the place, because I've lived in almost every town in Australia. We did 3 loops in 3 years. But also I met so many incredible people. You know, I met over a dozen World War I veterans. We were talking about the fighting in the trenches in France in 1915. You know, I met Sir Edmund Hillary, who climbed to the top of Mount Everest. I met Lindy Chamberlain, who had her baby taken by a dingo, which was the famous case.
Oh, right.
All these incredible people, some of them famous, but many of them unknown. And it gave our journey purpose. We weren't just tourists. You know, we lived on the road, and whenever we rocked up to a town, we would find, we'd ask and find who were the most incredible people. And so you know, traveling with purpose, even though it wasn't a filmmaking experience, it was a storytelling journey, and also embedding me in nature, surrounding me. I mean, I was snorkeling and exploring forests and deserts, and you know, I had hobbies. You know, I'd collect, I'd beachcomb, I would metal detect. You know, I was a typical. Well, maybe an atypical kid, but it was just an incredible childhood, which I'll always be forever grateful to my parents. And it did 2 things for me. Yes, it gave me a love of nature and people and being curious, but it also taught me that you could live any life you want to. You know, that was my paradigm. My parents were just like, you know, quite unusual authors. Well, my father was a caricature artist. He would draw the people as well as interview them. And they published these books called Endangered Characters of Australia, not Endangered Wildlife, right. Endangered Characters. So that was my incredible childhood. And then we came back to school. I finished school in a typical school in Sydney, and we all did well. We all came back, my siblings and all, we all slotted back in. And at the sort of top end of the class, you know, we weren't behind. We were actually excelled.
Right, which often happens with homeschooling.
Yes, that's true, and we just had this incredible rounded sort of childhood. So that set me on my course.
That's amazing. Do you know Paul Farmer, the founder of Partners in Health?
No, I don't say I can.
He has, he's an incredible person as well, and he has a similar story when he was a kid, going around in a school bus and being all over the place. So it's. Maybe more people should raise their children that way.
I mean, and we want to do that. You know, I've got 3 young boys, and you know, we do plan to do. Maybe it won't be multiple years, but you know, certainly long trips and maybe 6 months, or you know, maybe a year. You know, over the next. They're all still fairly young. I think I was the perfect age. You know, it's a 10 to 11-year-old and up.
Right.
So I got the most out of the trips probably of my siblings. My 4-year-old brother at the time remembers much less.
Right, exactly. Cool. So how did you get into filmmaking, even though it sounds like that was quite the preparation for filmmaking without a camera, but it was kind of everything else that we do?
Yes.
But how did you actually get into filmmaking?
Yeah, well, actually one detail I left off, John, was my mother bought a little camcorder, a little high-8 camera, when I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and I loved, you know, shooting little home movies with it. You know, it was just in my hands pretty quickly, and we took that around Australia, and you know, filmed quite a lot. But the thing that was sort of most pivotal for me, I'd say, was when we were in Broome in Western Australia. I think this must have been 1994. We met a man called Malcolm Douglas, and maybe some of your viewers will know the name, but certainly in Germany and parts of Europe, he's very well known. He was an incredible Australian filmmaker who, in the early 60s, travelled in a 4-wheel drive across the remote part of Australia. I think the journey took him from Cairns right across to Broome, where there was like no roads, you know, and it took 6 months, and he filmed it all up with Super 8 cameras, or actually it might have been 16mm cameras, and it was caught across the top. I think it was 1965, don't quote me on that. And from there, it was a smash hit film because it was meeting Aboriginal tribes who were still living very, as they had in some parts of the north in the mid-60s, not without contact, but really traditional lives. And you know, experiencing crocodiles and bush camping and all these things. And he went from there and created an incredible series of films. I think he made over 40 or 50 films from the mid-60s into the 2000s. We met him in 95 in Broome. He had a huge crocodile park, and I was witness to him interviewing my father, and I was watching his films as a boy. They were, it was on The World Around Us, a TV show that showed these films, and they went all over the world. So meeting him was incredible. I thought, wow, like he's got a life mixing wildlife and filmmaking. He left film behind by that point. He was shooting, I was Betacam and things. And over the next couple of years, back in Sydney, I would send him my little short films. I would, kept in touch with him, wrote him letters, and we visited him a couple of times on our journeys. And I pestered him, sending him things as I grew older. And when I think I was 19, he was in Sydney cutting, and by then I was doing a lot of, short films, non-fiction things mostly. And he asked me to come and edit some opening parts of his show. I was only 19 years old, and at the end of that, he asked me, would you like to be my cameraman and come back to Broome with me? I've got to drive a new vehicle all the way back from Sydney. And it was just like the opportunity of a lifetime. A 19-year-old kid being asked to film the very show that I grew up on.
Wow.
And now I was stepping into the television in a way. So it was just an amazing opportunity. And we drove to Broome in 4 days, thousands of kilometres. I think we covered 4,500 kilometres in 4 days and got to Broome. And then we did this epic journey up into the Kimberleys on a tiny little 20-foot tinny, we call it in Australia, tiny open boat. And we did a 6-week journey, living and camping on the beaches, filming by day. We had an incredible musician called Don Burrows, who was one of Australia's greatest clarinet players, who played all the music for his films for 40 years, but had never seen the high Kimberleys. And we took Don Burrows with us. And so, he was a living legend, has since passed away, but I got to spend time with him. So that was my start of my journey. And now I had a credit, at 19.
Wow. And did you go to university also?
And I was actually, I was already enrolled in an Australian college called North Sydney Technical College, which was quite well known for its film and television course. And I'd completed a year, but when I got that opportunity and they said, go, I actually came back and finished my diploma. Just thought it'd be nice to finish it later on. Right. And they gave me a lot of credit for the work I'd done.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's awesome. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That is quite a story. You really got going early.
Yeah.
And then it sounds like from the very beginning, it's almost like the environmental side of it came before the filmmaking. Is that right?
I think so, yeah. I think I was more immersed in nature, people. And look, the camera for me was an opportunity, an excuse to go places, to see people and document. And I had to learn the craft. I'm still learning the craft of storytelling. I think I was a cameraman at first. And in fact, I loved editing. I loved camera work. I didn't really aspire to be a director or a producer. I just loved shooting. Mm-hmm. And, I thought my life would be an editor when I was in my teens. And then I realized I don't want to be in a room all the time.
Right.
Loved camera work. And then for the next decade or so, thought I will be a cinematographer. I became I'm accredited with the Australian Cinematography Society.
I saw that. That's amazing. How did that happen? What was the path to getting that accreditation? And for those who don't know, it's very prestigious to be in one of these cinematographers guilds whatever country.
That's right. The ACS is very well revered, like the ASC in America. The ACS does have more documentary and other fields, but there's only been 300 odd members since its founding 60 years ago. So it's a very, very special group. And it was like, I think I've only cried a couple of times in my life. The day that I got the phone call from the president to say that I'd been accredited was just like,
wow. And what was
amazing.
that?
And that was it was for a series called Tales by Light. And I guess eventually, I should just finish, I did realise that if I wanted to do the work that I wanted to do, then maybe actually driving the directing or the producing of that was the right way to go, rather than be reliant on other projects coming to me. And I got a great opportunity that became Tales by Light. It's on Netflix. There's 3 series. It's sort of like a chef's table, if you like, for photographers, following different photographers around the world. And many of them, surprise, surprise, are nature, underwater photographers.
Right.
And it was for the first series of that. In fact, one film of the first series, an underwater episode on Darren Dew, an celebrated Australian photographer. And we were, involved. I know why it appealed to the ACS, because we were doing pretty special things in that film. Diving with humpback whales in heat runs. Flying drones over volcanoes in Papua. Doing night shoots, using a lot of light in his photography, long exposure photography on shipwrecks and things. So it sort of combined a lot of elements that sort of appealed.
And then you probably had those amazing photographs to incorporate into the film as well.
Absolutely, yeah. That's exactly right. The show sort of highlighted it. It's the journey of what's behind the photograph. And it's been done actually recently. Something similar was on Nat Geo called Photographer, which Paul and Christina Mittermeier appear in.
Oh, wow.
And so, Tales by Light was probably first, but, there's so many amazing photographers in the world and great stories behind them. So, it was a really special series. And we secured, it was such an honour that Netflix took it and took 3 series of it back in the day, back when it was a little easier to get things, like that onto the big streaming giants.
Right. And then you moved on and did an oceans show.
Yes.
Tell me briefly about that.
I remember watching Frozen Planet, the original, and before that, other David Attenborough series, BBC series, the gold standard of blue chip natural history filmmaking, although I find that term a bit pretentious, but the sort of the highest level has always been the BBC. And in the last few years, some of the top producers have gone on and created indie companies, and you've got your Silverbacks and others. But I remember watching Frozen Planet, the original one, and I think the use of stabilized cameras from helicopters was just mind-blowing. It was really, I think it was 2011. But beyond that, Blue Planet 2, I was just in awe of the filmmaking, the storytelling, and, that's something I hadn't worked in. And I got an opportunity in 2020, which sort of blew my mind, to direct and produce an episode of Our Ocean, what ended up being called Our Oceans, which was the sort of wet version of Our Planet. James Honeybourne was the executive producer, Jonathan Smith was the series producer, and this was the team behind Blue Planet 2. So it was a Blue Planet 2 for Netflix.
Wow.
And, I if I'm being honest with you too, going into it, I've got certain skills that I've learned over the years, but I never came up the ranks of this blue chip world, which is a certain special set of skills in the camera work, of course, but maybe more importantly, the storytelling. Mm-hmm. So,
and the producing.
And I learned a lot on the job. So it was an amazing 4.5-year journey. Barack Obama narrated the series, which was incredible. And I produced and directed and actually did camera work on the Southern Ocean episode, the last one in the series in the Southern Ocean, Antarctica, South Georgia. It was available now on Netflix.
Awesome. Great. All right. So your latest film is called Trade Secret. It premiered at Sheffield Doc Fest, which is one of the most prestigious documentary film festivals in the world. We're here in New York City in September of 2025, just after your international premiere at the Climate Film Festival. And congratulations on the film.
Thank you, Joe.
And for winning not 1, but 2 awards at the festival, which was incredible. Can you tell me about the origin of this film?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I'm so pleased you came to see the film. It was a very special premiere, over 7 years to get to this point. And any filmmaker who premieres a film at a festival, it's a wonderful miracle to get any film made. This one was a absolute passion project, which, it feels extraordinary to get to this point. For me, I'd always been waiting to find a subject matter that was demanding of a feature treatment. I don't think every story necessarily is. I remember seeing Hoop Dreams when I was a kid, and it was probably the first documentary I remember that really blew me away, that a story could be followed and told over years, and true verite, discovery, and the commitment of time that film, and it was a celebrated film. And I remember thinking that was amazing. I'd never heard of such a thing. And so that had stuck with me, and obviously nature and wildlife and the environment are the areas that are most interesting to me. But I've always been fascinated with the intersection between people and wildlife, where things cross over. So I'd always wanted to see polar bears in the wild. It had been a dream of mine, and I got an opportunity to go on a boat from Svalbard, which is an island, part of Norway. It's the high Arctic. It's as close as you can get on land, just about, to the North Pole. And from there, I boarded a ship with other guests, and we went up and we saw a polar bear for the first time. And for anyone who's been lucky enough to see one in the wild, it was, an unbelievable experience, more incredible than I could have imagined. Being 100 miles from the shore and seeing a bear, you're in the middle of the ocean, and then suddenly this huge animal, land animal, seemingly, is walking around on plates of ice and swimming and surviving. And it was just incredible. And but on the same trip, I was told by our expedition leader that, did you know this polar bear and their far roaming animals could end up being be shot by a trophy hunter? And the fact that trophy hunting, which I had heard of in, it's most well known in southern African countries, lions, elephants still get trophy hunted, shockingly, for people's ego. Put an animal on the wall.
And in the US, bears,
and in the US, yeah,
wolves.
That's right, around the world. But I just thought, come on, polar bears, are we serious? Are polar bears really being trophy hunted in 2012 when I was there? The icon of the climate crisis, and probably, I'd argue, the symbol of biodiversity loss around the world. We are in the sixth mass extinction right now. A million species are at risk of extinction. We know that 70% of the world's wildlife has disappeared in the last 50 years. It is an absolute devastating time we're living through, and yet polar bears are being trophy hunted. That just blew my mind, and I thought, okay, if I didn't know this, and I'm someone who actually feel like I know pretty much what's going on, big stories in conservation, how is this happening? And it stuck with me, and it still took a couple of years. When I was in and out of other projects, I'd kept my mind on the polar bear story, and I was thinking, what's a way into this story, And then I met, fortuitously, another trip to the Svalbard, a man walking along the road called Ole Leoden. He's a Norwegian photographer, expedition leader. And I was introduced to him, and Ole was working on a research project to try to find the data that had been suppressed on the hunting, the true hunting levels, the true trade levels, trophy hunting levels around the Arctic, but primarily in Canada. And I was like, wow, okay, here's an interesting person who's dedicating years of his life to try to find this data and for it to be useful for conservation. And I started following him, recording him, documenting him. And I ended up in 2019, still unfunded, still between other projects, but just taking whatever little money I could to keep going. We went to CITES in Geneva, Switzerland. Now, CITES, for those who don't know, it stands for the Convention on the International Trade, or Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES. It is a 180 country coalition group of countries that gather together usually every 3 years for their big COP, their big summit, where members vote and decide on what species demand more protection from trade, and maybe some species that maybe don't need that protection. But it specifically looks at the international trade. So when animals are moved across borders, it does not regulate the rules of sovereign nations. Countries can do what they like within their own national borders. But when an animal gets moved across a border, CITES kicks in. And
can you briefly describe Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 of CITES and what that means?
Yes, there's a lot of jargon, like any of these conferences.
The UN.
At the UN, and there are two important appendices to discuss. One is Appendix 1, and one is called Appendix 2. Now, Appendix 1 is a list of species that have been determined to be so vulnerable from trade, threatened and usually endangered species, that they have banned all international commercial trade. It is not allowed, and there's strict enforcement if countries break those rules. Animals like sperm whales, blue whales, gorillas, leopards, cheetahs, the great apes, animals, rhinos. These animals sit on Appendix 1, and quite rightly, because they're often suffering the effects of poaching, which is fueled by legal trade. It's a thing that people should also know about. When you have legal trade in a species, even regulated, it can allow more easily illegal, i.e. poached animals to enter the system, because when you have shipments of ivory, you can slip in a couple that were shot illegally down the road, and they get
missed,
greenwashed in, or paperwork can be falsified. So there's an Appendix 1 species, and then there's a thing called Appendix 2, which is much larger. Appendix 1 is a much shorter list, but Appendix 2 is hundreds and hundreds of animals, thousands, that are listed and that can be traded legally. It's a regulated trade, but it is a trade. And polar bears, which will shock many of your listeners, sit on Appendix 2. They can be traded across borders internationally, even in 2025 as we sit here today. There has been 2 attempts, proposals put forward by members of CITES to uplist polar bears to Appendix 1, giving them full international protection. That happened in 2010 for the first time, and then again it failed. And then another proposal was put forward in 2013. The countries that put those proposals forward was the United States and Russia as a joint proposal. And it was important the proposal came from range states. So when a species comes, what a range animal is where is its range? It's where does it actually live? And with polar bears, there's only 5 countries where polar bears are permanently living. Occasionally you get them that float across into Iceland, but polar bears aren't living in Iceland except the odd one that finds its way there. The 5 countries that have polar bears is Greenland, which is sort of administered by Denmark, Norway, Svalbard, up in Svalbard in the Norwegian Arctic. You have the United States, Russia, and Canada, and they make up the 5 range states. The proposals failed twice, which was shocking.
Yeah,
and
especially since the United States and Russia, which are the 2 big Cold War superpowers, even with them backing it, it failed.
Exactly. Yeah. Those geopolitics, a lot of those things are put aside at CITES, and people working there do work together, even when there's other, stresses on those countries. So that was shocking as well, and that formed a backdrop of the story too. How did that happen? I wanted to investigate that, and Ole's work that was ongoing was to try to find the data that was missing, the data that would have been most helpful to assist those proposals. And to find out the information that had been suppressed for many years on the true numbers of the hunting, the commercial trade and trophy hunting of polar bears, most specifically in Canada, although his research was very broad across all 5 range states. I then went to CITES in 2019. So I was following Ole. He was our main character. Didn't know who else would maybe it would be a solitary journey. Didn't expect it to be an ensemble film, but it did become one because we met 2 other people that sort of got pulled into the story. And one was a lady called Iris Ho, she's an incredible Taiwanese-born, lives in the United States, wildlife advocate. And Iris has been fighting for the protection of many endangered species for years and years, and worked specifically on polar bear trade protection back in 2013. And I met her at CITES in Geneva, and I also met another pretty impressive person, Dr. Adam Cruz. He's a South African-born wildlife investigative journalist. He covers all sorts of species, but mostly, most of his work does take place in Southern Africa, looking at trophy hunting and trade, live baby elephants being exported from the country. He's done numerous reporting. His probably most famous breaking news story was he was the journalist that broke the news of Cecil the lion, that famous lion that was shot by that American dentist back in 2015.
Right.
And his story ignited a sort of phenomenon that really swept the world. So these are the 3 characters we ended up following from 2019 onwards, even though our filming began 2017, 2018 more in earnest. So, 7-8 years to this point.
Wow. So on a couple different occasions, the characters in your film take hidden cameras into stores in both China and Norway and find a huge number of polar bear skins and body parts for sale. Those scenes are intense. I was kind of like shaking in suspense watching it. Can you tell me about these retailers and how this works, what's legal and what's illegal about what they're doing, and how did you all find out about them and then get these cameras in there, which is amazing to have this footage. It reminds me of The Cove and the Ivory Game, some, various really important environmental films that have similarly done this kind of secret recording.
Well, thank you, John. I mean, those scenes were some of the most intense but important scenes to capture for the film. And you mentioned The Cove, Ivory Game. These are films that, have been very influential to me, actually, it's worth saying. And Blackfish, I think they had, they were powerful, engaging deeply, but most importantly, they really moved the needle and changed public perception, brought these really...
had impact, the so hard to get impact of a film.
That's right. So, it wasn't like we were trying to replicate these films, but they certainly were places that we went to for inspiration. But your question was about the button cam recording. So yes, look, it's an interesting topic because there is a legal trade. So some of these scenes are legal. We wanted to show what does these numbers really mean? When you hear 300-400 polar bears a year entering the trade, it's just a number on a page. But it's a very different thing to see hundreds and hundreds of skins lined up, stack after stack, and then later heads, facing you.
The images are viscerally, shocking.
They are, and I think so. But what was, and I don't want to spoil everything for people who haven't seen the film, but, we also uncovered proof of illegal trade. When there is a legal trade, as I said before, there is opportunities to infuse illegally, i.e. poach now, to the animals, whether it's the bullet's a legal bullet or an illegal bullet, doesn't make a difference to the animal. But, they were untracked, not counted in the numbers. Where are they shot from? Where are they taken? So we found evidence of both. So it was, for me, more about showing the scale and the face of this trade. And I think it nowhere shows that better than a warehouse full of bear skins, but also tracking the trade around the world. We shot in, over a dozen countries. 9 feature in the film in the final cut. But we really wanted to show how international this is, how many countries are involved with this. Yes, the polar bears the trade is worth mentioning. All these bears are shot, at least the legal ones originate from Canada. It's the only country out of the 5 range states that feeds the international commercial trade. It's also the only country that has legal trophy hunting of polar bears. And what's worth noting, and sort of people might find this quite surprising, is that back in 1973, the 5 range states came together, and this was even more amazing in terms of Russia joining this in 73, in that Cold War period. They came together and signed a landmark agreement called the Protection of Polar Bears Agreement from the 5 range states. And that it's called the 1973 agreement. That agreement, because of the sort of unregulated mass trophy hunting and commercial trade occurring across the Arctic, including Alaska. Norway had huge commercial hunting of polar bears through the 60s, and Canada less so of trophy hunting back then, but had trade. They realised that the unregulated hunting was driving the species towards extinction. So they came together, they signed this treaty agreement that it's quite a quaint, short agreement by today's standards. It's only a few pages. But what it said is that all hunting of polar bears will be prohibited. But there was a clause, an exception made for local Indigenous hunting to continue using traditional methods for subsistence use, and that which was important. Polar bears have been a long important icon, symbol use for food, for clothing, for other cultural reasons across the Arctic. Today, polar bears are still hunted in Greenland. They're still hunted in Alaska in fairly small numbers comparatively for subsistent cultural reasons. There's no trade, there's no trophy hunting. But yet, despite this 73 agreement, Canada still exports and feeds the international trade. They still have trophy hunting, which I find quite curious. Like, how is that in the spirit of the 1973 agreement? And we don't have to get into all that detail now, but I think as I mentioned, is quite a simple agreement, and he doesn't feature in the film, but it's worth noting here, a little bit of a scoop for you. We filmed with a fellow called Thor Larson, who is, I think he's almost in his 90s now. He was the architect of the 1973 agreement. He's an amazing, the late Ian Stirling was another godfather of polar bear science, passed away a couple of years ago. It was very sad. But now Thor is absolutely the undisputed longest, even when Ian was alive. He's been studying polar bears longer than anyone else. He was the architect of the 1973 agreement, and we filmed him with Adam Cruz, actually, talking about that agreement. And he thinks it is what is happening today is not in the spirit of that agreement. It's in his opinion, in his words, a bit of a distortion of that agreement.
There's trophy hunting that's allowed in Canada, and a lot of those bears are the ones that end up on the international market. But is that international trade in bears hunted in Canada legal or illegal?
So it's a curious thing to know about CITES is that CITES regulates commercial trade. Now, trophy hunting is not considered commercial. It's considered recreational, or they call it non-commercial. Now, you can have commercial outfits that are running trophy hunting organisations. I would personally argue, I think trophy hunting, when organised through companies, and if you go to the big trade shows in Reno for trophy hunting, and it's a huge billion-dollar industry. So I'm not sure why it's considered non-commercial. However, it is. And because it is, those animals are able to be shipped from country to country, even Appendix 1 listed species, even rhinos. When you hear about a rhino being shot that's on Appendix 1, or a leopard that's in Appendix 1, you think, hang on, it's Appendix 1. How is that shipped from country to country? If it's done under trophy hunting, under the guise of trophy hunting, it was shot by a foreigner, comes in, they can apply for a permit under CITES. Now, different species have different regulations. Some countries ban completely the importation of trophy hunted animals that are on Appendix 1. So that it's tough, and there's quotas for certain species, but it is still possible. If polar bears end up on Appendix 1, which is the dream of the characters in our film and many people would like to see that, trophy hunting it wouldn't be automatically banned of polar bears, but what it would do, many countries severely restrict or completely ban the importation of Appendix 1 animals. And in the European Union, which is 27 nations that work together, they have a thing called an Annex A, another bit of jargon, but basically Annex A in their wildlife laws of the EU severely restrict. In fact, it would be probably outright impossible to get a polar bear imported into Europe. So there's 27 countries straight away. And, Germany have a lot of trophy hunters, and certain countries it's quite popular. So you would find a precipitous drop, I think, in numbers of polar bears being hunted for trophies. I mean, a good example, and the reason I say that is that in 1972, the Marine Mammal Protection Act in the United States banned the killing of polar bears in Alaska except for subsistent hunting. Right. It's around the same time as the treaty, but their laws were further strengthened in 2008 when they banned the importation of polar bears from Canada, because American trophy hunters, even after 72, they would go up to Canada, shoot a polar bear, bring it back to America. And really, I mean, Alaska and Canada, they're neighbours. And in 2008, that came into force when polar bears were uplisted to endangered status, and importation ended. And what happened? There was a drop. Because trophy hunters value the trophy. It's not just the photograph. It's important to bring the trophy home.
Right.
And
that's why it's called a trophy.
If you go and spend $50,000 to hunt a polar bear, but then you can't take the skin home, you may go somewhere else to hunt. It became less desirable for American trophy hunters, I think it's fair to say, to target. It still happens, but they won't be able to bring them home, and the numbers dropped. So Appendix 1 would most likely see a decrease in trophy hunting polar bears. And the other thing I'd like to say, again, I've learned a lot of this through the years of research on the film. Obviously, I have my personal opinions, even though I produced a film as a documentarian, that I wanted to be as fair and balanced to the issue and do it with as much integrity as possible, really. And I feel proud of the film that we've made.
So early in the film, you profile an Inuit hunter who's exercising his legal right to hunt polar bears. And he's using modern technology like a gun and a snowmobile, but still using polar bear for subsistence. And you're very careful to distinguish these tribal rights from the commercial trade in polar bears. And yet there's this commercial trade happening internationally. And as you said, Canada still allows hunting and export of polar bears. And I was wondering if you could talk about what other countries are doing and how that has impacted the status of the polar bear hunt and the those polar bears entering the international trade.
I think it's worth saying again that I am not, and I haven't. You don't meet many people that are against the cultural subsistent hunting that occurs in the Arctic, where people are living in remote communities. Polar bears have been a very important food source, and not just food and clothing, but cultural reasons for hunting polar bears. It's not in question here. And in other countries apart from Canada, Alaska and Greenland, there is subsistent indigenous hunting of polar bears, and it's at a much slower, smaller scale. There's no international trade. There's no trophy hunting. And it's fairly stable and fairly moderate levels. I think that what would happen, and it's important to say that if the international trade was ended globally, which would only affect one country for export, which is Canada, the indigenous groups within Canada would still have the legal right to hunt polar bears for subsistence for all of those reasons I've stated. That would continue. They would not be infringed upon. The bears would not be leaving the country into the open market. And if you look to the case studies in Alaska and Greenland, what you'll find is, and Alaska is probably the easiest one to sort of understand in America. In 1972, America decided, due to the dropping population of bears through overhunting, to list the polar bears as, to restrict trade and trophy hunting of bears. It was to be only carried out by indigenous groups for their cultural and subsistent reasons. And that was in 1972. It's almost 70% from all the years preceding since that ban. There was almost 400 bears a year hunted in Alaska up until 72, and it dropped drastically. It's like a cliff. And all the years since, if you add up all the and it varied over the years, but the average over all the years since, 70% down from where it was. And today in Alaska, we're looking at 30 to 40 bears a year are hunted for those cultural subsistent reasons. There just isn't the incentives financially for export in Alaska. So I think, those examples are pretty important to recognise. In Greenland, there is, since 2008, no export. So more recently, and those numbers are lower than they were prior to 2008. There is a correlation between export, financial incentive, and hunting levels. The other thing, which is not all about the numbers, and this is just things that I've learned over the years, is that it's about the selective nature of the trade and trophy hunting. And it's said very clearly in the film. The trade, the buyers, the international buyers, and the trophy hunters both value the largest, fittest animals. It's like this with elephants and lions, the lion with the biggest mane, the biggest tusks, the trophy.
You want the big, scary-looking trophy.
It's the definition of a trophy, Yeah. And so...
The bigger, the better.
Yeah. And then with polar bears, it's usually male bears, usually the largest bears possible, 9-footers, 10-foot, even polar bears go up to 11-foot. These are the ones being targeted and prized by the international traders, sellers, trophy hunters. And they are the warrior bears. They are the most... through many, many generations of natural selection, through being strong and fit, they have risen up to be those magnificent specimens. When you take them out, there is evidence, and it's been done, there hasn't been studies on this, I should say, in polar bears, but other species, like bighorn sheep, they've done studies where this unnatural selection, if you want to call it, selection of the largest, fittest, can have a detrimental effect on the genetics. You end up, there's tuskless elephants being born in Africa, in parts of Africa, because the big tusks it's a genetic disadvantage to be born with big tusks. And if you keep shooting the big ones, the ones with smaller tusks breed with ones with smaller tusks. And it's this science is well known. Even Ian Sterling, the great late Ian Sterling, acknowledged that in an interview that, he had grave concerns about this unnatural selection of largest fittest. So that's really important to state. You take away the international trade, if trophy hunting numbers are restricted, but because of that international trade ban, you will find, I believe, looking back at history, that less of those bears will be targeted, and overall hunting numbers tend to fall because of those actions.
Right. And, the history of the conservation movement around the world is interwoven with this desire to maintain large animals in order to hunt them as big game. And in recent years, there's been kind of a shift in the emphasis in the environmental movement towards pollution issues, climate change, for example. And poster bears, as you mentioned earlier, are literally the poster animal for climate change. And yet what you've documented is this massive threat to the species caused by specifically hunting. Climate change is still a huge factor in their threatened status, but you combine two, pressures on the species, it's much worse. And when we're talking about species extinction, whether it's with polar bears or other endangered species, do you think there's an overemphasis on the impacts of climate change to the detriment of understanding and highlighting other threats like hunting or human development and other human impacts that are threatening the species much more directly than climate change?
It's a good question. I mean, I think very few people dispute climate change is real. It's happening. Let's be serious. It's real. It's ubiquitously, agreed upon. The Arctic sea ice was its lowest recorded level in history in February of 2025. It's a dire situation. Polar bears, it is their greatest threat, long-term existential threat is climate change. But just because something's the largest threat doesn't mean that other threats should not be addressed if they can be addressed fairly easily. How the hell do we solve climate change tomorrow? We can't. The world's doing everything.
And even if we do, the warming continues for decades.
That's right. So, that is without question, but just because that threat exists doesn't mean the other threats shouldn't be addressed and looked at. International commercial trade as a threat to the species, we know the numbers. How many numbers of polar bears? The science is tough with polar bears. Counts are tough. They're expensive to do, to know how many polar bears exist in the world across the Arctic. They're hard. They're difficult to have counts. They're difficult to know which populations, subpopulations are doing well and doing worse. But what we do know is that overall they're doing worse. The science is shouting out about polar bears. But in many places, you won't see the international commercial trade in polar bears even being listed as a threat. But we have numbers showing the hundreds of polar bears that are shot for the trade or end up in the trade. So when we have pretty specific data on numbers of bears dying because of trade, that is something that we can quantify. And if steps were taken to remove that threat tomorrow with a stroke of a pen, we would be giving polar bears a fighting chance to tackle climate change. We don't know how they'll do over the next, 50 years. It's looking pretty bad, but let's give them every chance they've got. And there's a lot of examples in history of extinction. Even woolly mammoths.
Right.
We interviewed Professor Lister in England at the Natural History Museum, who's one of the foremost authorities on Pleistocene extinction. Like, this gentleman has studied woolly rhinos and woolly mammoths and all these great animals that disappeared. And we asked him, it's not in the film, but I asked him, why did woolly mammoths go extinct? And he said there's a consensus in the scientific community, in his peers, that woolly mammoths went extinct because of a combination of threats. They had survived interglacial warming numerous times. When the world would get, ice ages and interglacial periods where ice disappeared, their habitat disappeared. They had survived natural rhythms of climate change in the past. Probably their populations went smaller under that stress of a changing, warming world. But in the last interglacial period, which was, okay, not human-induced, but it was a warming period, they were reduced in their habitat. Their habitats were reduced, but it was at the same time when human hunting was really on the rise in the Arctic. We're talking several thousand years ago. And it was the combination of those threats that they believe drove the woolly mammoth to extinction.
And if you follow the path of humans coming out of Africa and spreading across the globe, it's pretty much the same path as the extinction of large mammals all over the planet. So right. We've been doing it a long time.
Yes, and that's just...
And hunting has always been an integral part of the push over the edge to extinction.
That's right. Even in Australia, my home country, we had megafauna. It's a continent without really megafauna. We have some crocodiles, we have some introduced water buffalo, but there's not really big land animals in Australia. Now, I don't know if it's a consensus, I wouldn't say that, but certainly one of the most esteemed scientists in the world, Dr. Tim Flannery, who's probably the world authority on certainly Australia's megafauna, he believes it was human hunting that caused Australia's great... we had, marsupials, a marsupial sloth that was over a ton.
Yeah.
These great huge animals that disappeared through humans, the spread of humans around the planet.
Yeah. Yep. So the opening shot in your film is this incredibly beautiful and heartwarming shot of a polar bear cub climbing on and snuggling with its mother. And looking back on the film now, I see that shot is a really key image for the introduction of your story. So under the narrative of this film is this huge question of how do we value nature in general, and wild animals in particular, and polar bears even more particularly. So this adorable shot of the polar bear and her cub remind the viewer of the beauty and the value of these animals for their own sake, regardless of any other value that human beings might put on them. But in the course of your film, we see how polar bears and other animals are really valued as a commodity, to be owned, to be even a symbol of conservation. And this may or may not include valuing the animals for their own sake. Can you talk a little bit about this question of how we value wild animals and how that question of value is woven into the film?
Oh, it's a deep question, John. I think there seems to be different ways of looking at protection of animals. You've got human rights and the ethics and the morals around it. Should an animal exist? There's conservation of a species means the species continues. And then there's the individual rights, the animal rights of individual animals, and whether or not they should be suffering at the hand of man. So these are big questions. And, I think people do sit on different sides of that equation. I mean, we're quite happy, most of the world, to consume animals. We have done for a long time. Industrial animals. I mean, I am not free of contradiction. I still eat meat. I've reduced it a lot, but I do. So I'm not. I can't stand up on a hill and point down at people. I've got a lot of things that I'd like to improve about my impact on the world. I think there's a lot of things wrong with how we treat animals. But I'd be very open in telling you that I still wear leather, I still eat meat. There's some big ethical questions around these issues. It's sort of like the question around trophy hunting. The idea of, well, if we shoot one, we could take money, a lot of money, and protect more animals. And some people don't have a problem with that. They think, okay, that's okay. We're protecting more, we can sacrifice one. And there's others that sit on the side of the fence saying, well, that's ethically wrong. Like, maybe we should find money another way through tourism. And even if there isn't another way, is that the right thing to do? We would never impose that standard on a human being. We would never take that on a human being, but with animals, even endangered and beloved animals, there is a subset of the population that is okay with that. I don't think that, I wouldn't sit here today and say that I don't think there are any examples that trophy hunting work. I think the one that I know of, probably the best, is in America. Duck hunting is pretty popular in some parts of America, and duck hunters have protected vast swathes of land to carry out their sport of hunting.
Long ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is there conservation benefits to that practice?
And do we need that hunting justification anymore, or is that anachronistic?
Well, that's true.
But it's also
it's an example.
It's a cultural difference as well.
Yeah, it's an example. And I think so. I think in Africa, a lot of this goes on. I don't see any reason when there are other ways to protect wildlife. And I think from what I've understood, and I've spent a long time looking at the subject, Adam Cruz has spent years writing reports about trophy hunting. I think the idea that trophy hunting is the way forward, I think the argument falls over. I mean, gosh, just look at tourism. They talk about the millions of dollars so-called dollars that flow into Africa from trophy hunting. Compare it to the tens of billions of dollars that ecotourism brings to the continent of Africa. Right. I mean, the millions of tourists that come and go to safari, want to see live animals. I don't think there's it's not even a debate on terms of money in. But that's another conversation. I mean, trophy hunting really isn't the subject of the film. We touch upon it because it's an aspect of the film. The film does look at the international commercial trade. And if, as I said before, if polar bears were uplisted and given full protection, trophy hunting would not be ended overnight of polar bears.
Right. And then there was that situation, what country was it in, where they had the chance to sell all that ivory, the elephant's tusks again, but they decided to burn it all and make a big show of burning it. Where was that?
That was in Kenya.
That's what I was thinking, Kenya, yeah. And
symbolic and important.
And I feel like that really gets at that question we were talking about earlier of for what reason do you value these animals? And that was a show of we do not value these animals for their bodies as commodities.
Yes.
And it was very powerful.
Yeah.
And it was the right thing to do. Could they have taken that money and, hired a bunch of rangers? Yes, they could have. But sometimes the values are more important than the dollars and cents.
No, it was very symbolic, and I think it sent a statement. I think that was very, very important, and I think some lessons had been learned from what happened in 2008. So that was very admirable.
And you can still, as you did, you can still make an economic argument that ecotourism is more valuable than trophy hunting.
That's an easy argument to make.
And poaching.
Oh, absolutely. They pale. They're not even worth comparing.
Right.
And look, tourism is not perfect. Tourism can have detrimental impacts. When it's not done well. When it's, there's areas in Africa that have just got out of control tourism without control, and it can have really harmful effects. So it has to be done ethically. Ethical tourism is really important as more and more people want to travel and experience. And not everyone in the world can. In some of the most fragile parts of the world,
right?
Not everyone can go see a polar bear.
We don't want everyone to see them, because we're in trouble.
That's right.
It turns into Yosemite.
Yeah.
So, I was at the screening over the weekend, and a number of people expressed anger after watching the film. And this anger was not at you at all. It was, but it was at some of the people depicted in the film, and the fact that this was still allowed. Anger at individuals, anger at countries, anger at humanity for facilitating this continued trade in polar bears. And I've heard some people say that they want some outlet for that anger at the end of the film, something to do, to act, to not just be like, okay, now, what other terrible things happening in the world, but what can I do about this? But at the festival, I heard you say a couple of times, you're not an activist, and you don't see your role as specifically advocating for for actions that the audience ought to take as a result of watching the film. Can you talk through that? This is, as an environmental filmmaker myself, it's something that I grapple with a lot. And I was just wondering if you could kind of talk through your position about that and what you see your role as being in, related to the polar bear trade.
Sure. No, it's a really good question. As I said earlier, we never knew where the story would take us, where it would lead. We didn't set out with an agenda, except, as I mentioned, I heard polar bears are trophy hunted and it turned into trade, and I thought this is a story worth exploring, worth unpacking. I want to learn about this. Let's learn about it with a camera. Let's document it. And, the journey went from there. I think I'm a filmmaker. I'm a documentarian. I feel very proud of the due diligence, the integrity that we brought to the reporting, the presentation of what we captured, what we documented, didn't distort, didn't change the scenes, the experiences that we had. I can sleep at night knowing that what the film is, as uncomfortable as it is, as dark as where it goes, it's what is happening in the world. And I think it needs to be seen by mass audiences. I want the film to speak. I think the film speaks for itself. Yes, I have personal views. I've expressed many of them here. I'm happy to do that. I'm not going to sit and be silent, but I'm not. I think what would happen, John, if we had big calls to action at the end of the film, this is what you've got to do, I think it would change the entire perception of this film. If we were being didactic to tell the audience, this is now what you have to do, because we told a story, as I said, as fairly as possible. I want people to make up their own mind. Not everyone will agree. I mean, there's a vast, spectrum of opinions on all of these issues, and they'll see the film through those lenses. But I think if we'd been telling you what to do at the end, it would probably change how the entire film was viewed by the public. It's not to say I don't want the film to have impact. Of course, I would love to see polar bears uplisted to Appendix 1, but it's not the job of the film now, beyond the film. I think it's the job of others, and I'll always support efforts to bring greater protection to these species, not just polar bears. It does go a bit more meta at the end of the film. But the film itself I think can be a powerful statement, and people can interpret it the way they want to. I think the difficult thing is with polar bears specifically about getting them Appendix 1 protection from trade is it has to happen at CITES. It's really only 5 countries that can put forward a proposal. Other countries, Fiji could put a proposal forward, but it tends to be
taken seriously.
It has to be taken seriously as a range state.
Right.
I think the time is now to bring this issue back to discussion. Polar bears are in a worse place than they were in 2013, but where mass awareness can put pressure on governments, that virtually every government in the world has a CITES delegation, and if countries hear enough from their people, then this issue could be brought back onto the public discussion for debate. And but more broadly, I think the film, if I can say so, I think speaks to a greater problem about the idea of sustainable use. It's a bit of a euphemism. Now, sustainable use is not inherently a bad thing. Sustainable farming, sustainable, we need things to survive. Humanity needs food. So sustainability, of course, is great. But when it comes to sustainably using, which means trading, selling, consuming endangered species, I struggle to understand how that is a reality in this modern time we live in.
Right.
While they're all going through this mass extinction crisis, which is affecting so many species. So,
and it has a long history of being used as the justification for tearing down environmental protections. Ronald Reagan's environmental, EPA and environmental position was wise use of nature. And that was their banner with which to tear down all the progress that had been made in the previous couple decades around environmental laws.
Well, that's right. And there's just so many, the wild places like Sylvia Earle talks so eloquently about, particularly with the marine world, but there are so few wild places left for the remaining wild creatures in this world. Sometimes you just should be protect and leave alone. Don't protect and use, because that does lead to, unfortunately, the way humanity is, that when money gets involved, we just, as a humanity. We just take more and more, and we consume more, and there's other people that will come in and find ways to abuse a system. But when you have protection, you protect an area, you protect a species, give it a fighting chance, I think that's the way forward. That's my personal view. And my goal now is for the film to be seen by the widest possible audience, for people who engage with it, to start conversations, to be a spark, an ignition point for real discussion, to take a lot of these dark subtopics out of the shadows into the light and have civil discussion, urgent conversation around these issues, not to burn the house down or to a witch hunt or anything like that. I want the film to be a spark for good, meaningful debate around these issues that have been far too long left unsaid and unspoken. And that's really always going to be my position on the film.
So I totally understand your position as a documentary filmmaker. But now, speaking as Abraham,
yes,
what do you think needs to happen to protect polar bears?
I think the most likely countries to put the proposal forward, the most likely country at this point in time, in 2025, would be Norway. It's a challenging time in the United States. It's a challenging time in Russia. Understatement. Canada, I can't see putting a proposal forward to, uplist polar bears to Appendix 1. That remains 2 of the 5 range states, which is Denmark, Greenland, Denmark, and Norway. But the last 2 times, Denmark was really ended up voting against the proposal.
Why?
So, possibly solidarity with Canada and their groups. I don't know. That's just a theory, but yeah, I don't know the reason. And there's a lot to unpack there with the EU, and they were supposed to vote as a bloc, but it does leave Norway as the country that could take the leadership. And Norway, like lots of countries, but particularly Norway, they want to be seen to be doing the right thing. They are making, even though they pump a lot of oil, they're still at the same time doing a lot of green initiatives. It's a bit of a
contradiction,
but
yes.
they want to be seen as being leaders in tackling climate change, protecting species, but they're still whaling in Norway legally. Right. There's still polar bear trade through their country. They could have ended it. They could have had a unilateral decision to end national trade.
Right.
And there were efforts to do that recently, but that failed.
And they fight vociferously to protect whaling rights as well.
They do. So it's a tough challenge. I think we're in a really challenging period right now, if I'm being honest. But sadly, time will have to tell on this issue. I want the film. Films like The Cove and Blackfish didn't solve their problems.
Right.
There is still a dolphin slaughter in Japan.
Yep.
Although it's much, much less than it was. There is still orcas in captivity around the world, although they've ended breeding programs. So progress can be made without, completely solving a problem. It doesn't mean we can't fight. So I think the film, if you're asking me, Abraham, what I want the film to be, yes, I would love the film to be part of it. I don't think it would ever take claim of a successful uplisting if that occurs, and I hope it does. If it's part of that conversation, and it's a way for people to learn more about this issue or even understand there is a trade in polar bears, then I'll feel, that would fill me with great satisfaction. I like that to happen.
So it's Climate Week in New York City. You get to meet Jane Goodall this afternoon, who's one of my all-time great heroes. Are you excited about that?
Oh, of course. Sylvia Earle, Jane Goodall, icons, pillars of...
This film has been quite the entree into that world for you.
World,
that's
absolutely.
Amazing.
I've been very fortunate.
Congratulations.
Thank you. No, I was not to name drop, but I did actually interview Jane Goodall already for the film. And she gave a beautiful interview in London a few years ago now. But we didn't actually end up including it in the film. And actually for your filmmaking, and I imagine a lot of your listeners are filmmaking listeners, we shot over 200 interviews for the film, 240 interviews
Wow.
over the course of several years. Now, that probably surprises you because it's not a talking head film.
Right.
There are very few sit-down interviews in the film. I think part of it was being a naive filmmaker. You know, we're talking 7, 8 years ago. I've learned a lot over the time, but I don't regret those interviews because every single one of them was almost like research with a camera. Each one informed the filmmakers, me and my team, and some of those interviews led to little pathways to other scenes and other explorations that we made through those interviews, through those connections. So they weren't wasted, but there is so much material that I have in those 240 interviews that is valuable material, you know, powerful words. Jane Goodall's one of them. We had this interview with Jane, but it just didn't fit into the film. You know, it would have been, there was no place for her to suddenly appear and give comment on a part of an issue. And in the end, we've discovered the most powerful delivery mechanism was the true story of the three main characters, their lives exploring this topic.
No doubt.
And so the few exceptions to that rule is maybe a very specific, you know, sometimes specific comments were made from someone who was there, like at CITES.
Right.
And we would maybe feature a few words from that person, but
yeah,
not people just coming up and giving general comments on the topic.
Well, I think there are a lot of environmental films that are kind of like greatest hits albums, and they get all the most famous environmentalists in the world to comment on X, Y, and Z, and then they put them together as a film, and I'd never find those films terribly compelling, even though I like those people for the work they've done very much, but it doesn't mean they're the right fit for this story.
Yeah, and there's always exceptions to the rule, isn't there, too? I'm not against films that have lots of talking heads. I mean, you know, I can think of several that are very, very well done. But yeah, for our film and just the subject, I think we made the right choice.
Yeah. And has Jane Goodall seen a cut of the film that you know of?
She has not yet seen the film, but she knows about it, and we'd very much like her to see it.
Yeah.
I've been speaking to her team, and many of them want to see it very shortly, and they will. And I know that she'll be aligned with the message of the film, you know, putting the species first, above politics, above... politics is pretty much the driving factor in a lot of these decisions, you know.
Yeah.
Concessions, economics. So yeah, she is a champion for nature, as is Sylvia Earle and David Attenborough, and many of our most beloved icons.
Yeah, that's great. So thinking back on how you viewed animals as a kid, how has your relationship to animals changed through all of this work you've done in filmmaking and traveling all over the world and being so close to so many different types of animals?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't been asked that before. I think when I started out, if I'm being really honest with you, John, early in my filmmaking career, probably when you're young and trying to prove yourself and trying to, you know, get runs on the board, I would probably push myself harder and push, you know, I could be guilty of pushing the limits of getting the shot. You know, at what expense?
Right.
You know, do you track down an animal with a camera? You might not be shooting it, but, you know, interfering into its, you know, hunt or its environment, or if you're underwater, getting too close. I'm not, you know, I don't think I did anything that really overstepped the mark, but as a little bit of an older filmmaker now and a bit slower, I would say...
There was a different culture back then.
And a different culture. And and I think just being more respectful of the species. And, you know, it's not the most important thing to get the shot. It isn't.
Right.
You know, not at the expense of hurting or really, you know, impacting on an animal. So I think I'm always, you know, on the other shoots that I've done, the more nature-focused shoots, I'm always impressing on people, look, you know, we're privileged to be here with cameras. Often you have special permits that give you closer access to the animals, whereas if you're a general public, you wouldn't have that. But you really have to respect the animals that you're working with, and just know when to not get, you know, to overstep the mark. And I think there's definitely ethics when it comes to filmmaking that I'm a big proponent of. The other thing I hear sometimes, I have young children, And I hear sometimes people say, I want this animal to be there for when my kids grow up and so they can see it. And I understand that statement. And I, of course, want my children to see an animal. But it's often the way people describe their desire for an animal to exist so they can see it,
enjoy it.
Their kids can enjoy it. And I think, and I've probably said similar things in the past, but what about just the inherent reason for that animal to exist on this planet without having us to have a benefit from that animal being there? I mean, I think that's where my heart sits more now, rather than I want to be able to show it off or to have people see it or to have my children see it or for even me to see it. If an animal exists and I never get to see it again, but I know that it's there and it's alive, that's enough for me.
Yep.
And many of the most vulnerable and critically endangered species on the planet should be left alone as much as possible.
Yeah, and this anthropocentric worldview really permeates everything in our culture. It's like even when it's about conservation,
yes, it's
so often phrased in those self-serving anthropocentric terms.
Yes, and it can be very effective in fundraising. And, maybe sometimes it is valid to use those connections because, look, I heard David Attenborough say once, you must hate zoos. And I saw him live speak in Sydney, which was very special a few years ago. And someone said that to him. And he said, well, actually, look, his answer, and I'm paraphrasing, probably butchering it from the great man, but I loved his answer. And the spirit of his answer was, look, I wish we lived in a world that didn't require zoos, but we don't. And if a zoo is run as well as a zoo can be, the best zoos in the world that are at the highest standards of animal, protection and care, they have a great role in breeding programs for critically endangered animals. But his point that he was more making was, for many children around the world, here in New York, I think he used it as an example, a zoo can be a place that young children can be brought and to start to see animals. Not everyone in the world has that ability, and to build empathy and actually, rather than just a rat or a pigeon in the park, but actually see other species, and that is important. But films can also bring that love of animals to vast audiences. So I think I loved his answer. And so sometimes the human experience is important because, if we've got any chance of saving so many of our most vulnerable species, we need more people caring and wanting them to exist as we get more and more sucked into the technological world, and people are getting more and more disconnected with nature. And you'll hear Sylvia Earle and Jane Goodall, that all talk about the connection is being lost with nature. And I think these things play a really, really important role.
Yeah, for sure. And we're at this really difficult moment in the environmental movement. What do you see kind of generally as a path forward right now, either for yourself or for where do we need to head? I mean, that's a huge question, but.
Huge question. I mean, I guess I can answer this question, which would be for filmmakers that are in the environmental space, there's two things. I would like Trade Secret to be an example of it is possible to tell just about any story. This was an uncommissionable film. If you pitched this film to a distributor, streaming giant from the outset, there's no way that it would be, financed. It had to be done another way, and we had the film privately financed with no creative input, which was sort of the dream for any filmmaker. Just here you go, here are the resources to go tell that story. But even so, one is I want people to know that you can tackle any subject if you do it with integrity and with enough time and passion, and you need to be in love with the subject because there are tough periods, there are tough rejections, there are missed opportunities, so much heartbreak and dismay, gaining access, financial burdens, family burdens. So you need to have that shining light of I want to make this film because it's an important story. It has to be told. It has to be, I have to finish. I have to make this film. You need that driving you. And I had that in spades with this film. But the other thing, if I'm being a reality check, is we're living in such a difficult time for independent film, and maybe even the most for environmental films, because there's just been such a shift in what is being presented to audience. I don't think it's a shift in what consumers want. But I think the algorithms are feeding back on themselves with more true crime, more celebrity docs. And then, of course, the algorithm is going to say they did well. Because if you only serve the same dishes to everyone
Right.
and they choose from that menu, the algorithm is being fed, okay, well, they keep watching these things. And viewing habits can be also driven into people. But I know there is great public interest for a vast majority, not just films like Trade Secret, but for many underrepresented stories in nature and in all sorts of social justice categories. There is, but we're in a challenging time because they are simply not being given the opportunities. And the thing that breaks my heart is, what are the films that are not going to be started because people just think it's too tough?
Yeah.
Back when you had a chance of getting it onto a big streaming platform, like a shot, if you made a good film, you could go into it and look an investor in the eye or friends and family or a partner and say, look, we make a great film. We've got a great subject. We have a good chance of it being distributed. Now, with that sort of almost impossible task of distribution that people face, what stories won't even begin to be documented because people think it'll be too hard. So my message to them is these are multi-year journeys, just the conditions we're in now. Don't let that affect the decision later on. And I'm hopeful, and there has been some little signs that maybe things will get better, that by the time you finish your film, there'll be other options for distribution, and maybe some of these existing giants will start to embrace independent documentary film a little bit more than they are at the moment. So, yeah, I don't give up, I would say, is my message. Yeah. And, we haven't, at this moment, late September 2025, we do not have distribution for Trade Secret yet, confirmed, but I'm hoping that the momentum coming out of Climate Week and the Climate Film Festival, which we premiered at with Sylvia Earle and our esteemed panel, that we will start to build momentum towards that distribution dream. And if I can do a little plug for the film.
For sure.
The website, if people are interested to learn more about the film, there's a website which is tradesecretfilm.com. It's pretty easy to remember. That has information about the film, the filmmakers, the subjects, but most importantly, where to see it, festivals, and any news about distribution. Everything will be it's a portal for all that information. And this is just the beginning, really.
Yeah, great. So Abraham, I've asked you to bring a quotation that's been particularly meaningful in your life and through your work. Can you take a minute and read it to us and tell me about it?
Yeah, sure. There's endless, fabulous, inspiring quotes out there. One particular one that came to mind when you asked me was, I do love the quote, and I don't think it's attributed to anyone. It's an old comes from a Greek proverb. And I'm probably butchering it here, but a version of it goes, society grows great when old men plant trees on which will provide future shade that they will never enjoy. I just love that concept. I've also, for many reasons, it's basically talking about selflessness,
right,
and the greater good,
yeah,
and sacrifice, and it's as an acknowledgement of the passing of time, in our own lives. So I've always liked that. People can interpret it different ways, but
yeah, it's beautiful. And it's so antithetical to what drives our world right now, is so much, not even thinking much less about grandchildren, but about like 2 years from now. So much is just what gets me the most immediately.
Exactly. And decisions that are maybe bring a little bit more discomfort to now, but the world will be a better place later. We're always living in the now, consuming in the now. Look at the national parks that were protected, with foresight, and how much that has played into, they say it's the greatest decision America ever made, and they were the first in the world, and they led to so.
And imagine trying to protect that land now.
Exactly.
We could have a lot more parks, but they're almost impossible to start now.
That's right. Exactly right. So I think it's a nice quote that
I love it. Well, thank you for sharing that. Well, Abraham, thank you so much for spending all this time talking to me today. It was fabulous to meet you here at Climate Week. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens with Trade Secret. And I hope the polar bears can get protection from hunting soon. I hope there's a big impact that this film has on that conversation. That would be amazing.
Thank you, John. Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure chatting to you, and thanks for bringing the film to a bigger audience. And if I can ask everyone just to keep sharing it and sharing the news of the film.
Once you do have a distribution plan, we'll share that as well.
Fabulous.
Awesome.
You.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to the Chrysalis podcast. Please subscribe at johnfiege.earth, where you can also find show notes and all episodes of the podcast, plus my writing, photographs, and films. I want to send a very special thank you to all of our paid subscribers. Your membership allows us to grow, flourish, and remain free and ad-free for everyone. Your belief in the work that we're doing and your generous support mean the world to me and the podcast team. Thank you.